In the dead silence of space where no sound could be heard, the prison ship Orpheus drifted towards the red planet. Mars loomed like a fiery scar in the cold vacuum of space, a ball of dust and iron with its barren surface stretched out before it. The ship, sleek and silent, was not much larger than a standard freighter but had been retrofitted for one purpose: transporting prisoners. Captain Sienna Drake stood in the observation deck staring out at the view. Her dark hair, tied back in a loose bun, swayed gently with the ship's movements. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, never left the glowing orb of Mars as it grew larger. Beneath her usual composed demeanour, a faint shiver ran through her spine, though she would never admit it to her crew. "Captain!" A voice behind her broke her focus. She turned to see Lieutenant Markson, his face flushed with tension. "We're nearing the orbit. The prison complex is just ahead. Ready for the final drop-off?" Drake gave a nod, though she felt a tightness in her chest. "Let's get this over with. How's the prisoner?" Markson hesitated, then spoke, his voice laced with unease. "Unusual, Captain. He's different from the others. I've been reading his file. He's not like any other inmate we've had. Something about him doesn't sit right." Sienna raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't talk much, but when he does, well, it's like his words crawl under your skin. He keeps referring to something, the darkness, like it's watching him. And when he looks at you, it feels like he's seeing right through you. Like he knows your worst fears." Drake frowned. "That sounds like paranoia. We've had a lot of those in the past. Mars isn't exactly a vacation spot." "That's not it, Captain," Markson continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I swear when I looked into his eyes, I saw something otherworldly, like something had taken root inside of him." Drake's jaw tightened. The Orpheus had been to Mars countless times, carrying convicts to the government facility on the surface. A remote prison, isolated from the rest of humanity, where the most dangerous and unhinged were kept. Mars was the last resort. No one escaped from Mars. "Keep an eye on him, Lieutenant. We don't know how stable this one is." Markson nodded, but his face betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Yes, Captain." Sienna turned back toward the window, staring at the prison complex below. It was a sprawling structure, far more advanced than the primitive facilities one would expect on a planet like Mars. Underground tunnels, hidden chambers, and high-tech security systems kept even the most dangerous criminals isolated. But there were rumors, whispered among the crew who had worked here for years, about things that went on inside those walls. Things not even the government wanted to acknowledge. The ship shuddered as it entered Mars's atmosphere. The bright red landscape beneath them was scattered with craters and dust storms, a hostile environment that could kill anyone unprepared. But this prison was built to endure, to make sure its occupants could never leave. The Orpheus docked at the prison's facility, a massive underground compound carved deep into Mars's crust. The prison's entrance was almost invisible from the surface, hidden within a network of natural caves and tunnels. Only the government knew the exact coordinates. It was a place where society's worst were forgotten, buried in a graveyard of silence. Captain Drake and Lieutenant Markson led the prisoner down the sterile, metallic corridors, their footsteps echoing in the eerily quiet hall. The prisoner, a tall man with pale skin and dark eyes, walked between them, shackled and motionless. His name was Voss, but he was known by a different title in the prison system, the Nightmare. His file had been classified, encrypted beyond standard clearance, but even with the details hidden from most, there were whispers. Voss had once been a scientist, a genius even, and a member of a top-secret government project. His work had involved the study of dark matter, quantum physics, and the very fabric of reality itself. But something had gone wrong, very wrong. One day his team had vanished, leaving only a single report behind, a report that had been immediately sealed by the highest authorities. Voss had been found days later wandering the streets, dishevelled and babbling incoherently. His mind had fractured, and he had become something far worse than anyone could have anticipated. Aidan Voss had been locked away for good reason. He wasn't like the other prisoners. As they moved deeper into the prison, the air grew colder, the walls pressing in on them, as if the very facility was alive, watching. Markson unlocked a heavy security door and led them into the solitary confinement wing. The cells here were reinforced with steel and mesh, designed to keep even the most dangerous inmates from escaping or causing harm. They shoved Voss into his cell with minimal ceremony. He didn't resist. He never did. His eyes remained locked on Drake, unblinking, as though he could see past her, into the very depths of her soul. "You'll be safe here," Markson said, his voice wavering. He quickly locked the cell door, turning to Drake. "No one's ever gotten out, not even close." Drake nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "We'll see. Just make sure he's monitored. I don't care how. This one doesn't get any chances." Night fell on the prison. Outside, the wind howled across the barren surface of Mars, but inside, the prison was silent. Too silent. Captain Drake sat in her office, reviewing the security footage from earlier. Nothing had happened yet. Voss was still locked in his cell, but she couldn't stop thinking about what Markson had said. What had Voss meant by the darkness, and why did it seem like the entire prison was holding its breath? The monitor flickered, static running across the screen. For a moment, she thought it was just a glitch, until the image cleared. Voss was standing in the center of his cell, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. His mouth moved, but no sound came from the speakers. His body was rigid, as if he were in some kind of trance. And then, without warning, the lights in the hallway flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped. Drake leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. On the screen, something shifted behind Voss. A shadow, too dark, too thick to be a normal reflection. It seemed to move, slithering across the walls, crawling along the floor. Voss's eyes glowed brighter, and a deep, unnatural voice echoed in the silence. "The darkness is coming." The temperature dropped further, and the flicker of the lights intensified. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Voss collapsed to his knees, breathing heavily, and the shadow vanished. Drake's heart pounded in her chest. What had just happened? The prison sensors showed no unusual readings, and the security systems remained intact. But the footage was undeniable. She quickly ordered a team to check on Voss. They arrived at his cell to find him curled on the floor, staring at nothing, his body trembling. "He's been talking to something," one of the guards said, his voice shaking. "I don't think he's alone in there." The next few days were a blur of unsettling occurrences. Prisoners complained about strange noises coming from the walls, whispers that echoed through the halls late at night. Some guards reported seeing flashes of movement at the edge of their vision, figures that weren't there when they turned to look. It didn't take long for rumours to spread. Some said it was just the stress of being on Mars, the isolation. Others, those who had been here longer, claimed it was the prison itself. They spoke of the old part of the complex, deep underground, where the shadows seemed to move on their own, where things had happened that no one could explain. No one dared to go down there. Captain Drake wasn't one to believe in ghosts or superstition, but the longer she stayed on Mars, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then came the worst discovery. Late one night, after the disturbance in the lower levels of the prison, the guards found something horrifying. They'd been following the sounds of scratching and pounding, echoing from the oldest section of the prison. When they reached the source, they opened a door that had been sealed for decades. Inside was a cell, empty, except for a series of strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that looked like they had been etched in blood. And in the centre of the cell, a name was written, fresh as if it had been done only moments ago. Voss. The discovery of Voss's name in the old cell was a violation of everything that had been believed about the prison. That room, that particular section of the facility, had been abandoned for years, sealed off after the last incident, a case so horrifying that the authorities had erased all records of it. No one knew about the symbols, and certainly no one was supposed to know Voss had been in that area. Not until now. Captain Sienna Drake stood at the threshold of the room, staring at the walls, where the blood-red symbols seemed to shimmer in the dim light. They were intricately carved, each line and curve more complex than anything she had ever seen before. Some of them resembled ancient runes, while others were completely foreign, unrecognizable. "How did this happen?" she muttered under her breath. Lieutenant Markson, who had been by her side throughout this unsettling discovery, leaned in closer, his face pale. "It's impossible. The facility was checked and rechecked. This section was locked up after the last incident." He hesitated. "That wasn't supposed to be here." Drake's mind raced. The old section, the one that had been sealed off, was a part of the prison that was avoided by all. Rumour had it that it was built on top of something older, a remnant of a failed government project that had been abandoned before the facility itself had even been constructed. The whispers that echoed through the prison were not just from the prisoners. The very walls themselves seemed to groan with the weight of its dark past. She turned to Markson, her voice cold but firm. "We need to get this cleared up. This is a breach, and I want every file on this area dug up. Now." That night, as Captain Drake reviewed the old security tapes and began to piece together the unsettling puzzle, something else was happening. It was subtle at first. A flicker in the lights, the distant rumble of the ground beneath the facility, but then it grew stronger. A low hum, almost imperceptible, reverberated through the walls. Voss had been silent since his strange episode days earlier, but as the prison's atmosphere thickened, with an unshakable dread, he began to speak again, this time to himself. He muttered something that sent chills down the spine of anyone within earshot. "The darkness has come. It calls to me." Captain Drake stood in front of his cell, her breath steady despite the gnawing discomfort growing in her gut. She looked through the observation window at Voss, who sat hunched in a corner of his cell, his eyes wide and unblinking. His body shook violently, but he didn't make a sound. "Get the guards ready," Drake ordered, her voice tight. "We can't let him reach the old section. If he's planning something, we need to stop him before he can do it." She stepped away, but as she turned the corner, a sudden crashing sound echoed from the observation chamber. The alarms blared, loud and shrill, ripping through the silence. "Captain, get to the holding cells, now!" Markson's voice over the comms was frantic. Drake's heart pounded as she rushed toward the disturbance. She knew what this was. The darkness had started to stir. By the time Drake and her team reached the cell block, the situation had already escalated. Voss was no longer in his cell. The thick steel door had been torn apart, bent like paper, as though he had simply willed it to bend. The corridor was filled with a thick, suffocating fog that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature had dropped dramatically. A low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the fog. Drake's hand hovered over her sidearm. Something in the air was wrong. This wasn't just another escape attempt. This was different. "Search the area," Drake ordered, her voice cold and composed. "Fan out and check every inch of the hall." The team moved with precision, but the fog only seemed to thicken with every step they took. It was as though the very structure of the prison itself was alive, shifting and distorting around them. Strange noises filled the air, scraping sounds, low whispers, and an occasional metallic clang. as though unseen forces were moving just out of their reach. One of the guards, his flashlight flickering weakly, shouted, "Captain, over here!" Drake turned, moving quickly toward the voice. She found the guard standing over a pool of dark, viscous liquid, the same hue as the ink-black fog. It was leaking from the walls, dripping like something alive. At the center of the puddle, a single handprint was etched into the floor. The fingers splayed in a grotesque pattern. "That's..." The guard's voice faltered, and he stepped back. "That's not human." Drake stared at the handprint, her heart hammering. It was larger than any human hand, the fingers unnaturally elongated, and the markings on the floor seemed to pulse faintly, as if the ground itself were breathing. "We need to get out of here now!" the guard shouted again, backing away. But before they could turn, a low, crackling sound echoed through the fog. The air shimmered, and a figure slowly emerged from the mist. Voss. But he was no longer the man they had brought here. His body was distorted, twisted in ways that defied nature. His eyes were completely black, empty voids where there should have been pupils, and his skin had taken on an unnatural sheen. Like something not quite alive, he stood in the center of the fog, his limbs stretching unnaturally long, the fingers curling like claws. "Release me," he whispered, his voice not his own. It was like a chorus of voices, 1,000 different tones, blending into one chilling demand. Drake raised her weapon. "Stay back, Voss. Don't make me do this." But Voss, or whatever had become of him, smiled, revealing a set of teeth that were too sharp, too many, and too wide. He took a step forward, and the air around him seemed to distort, bending like heat waves from a furnace. "Too late," he murmured, and with that single word, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble violently. The prison's alarms blared louder, the walls shaking as if the facility itself was collapsing in on itself. The once immovable structure of the complex was now breaking apart, crumbling from within. Lights flickered and sparked, and the sounds of metal twisting and breaking echoed through the corridors. Voss extended his hand, and the ground cracked open in front of him. From the crevices, something slithered into the light, a black mass, shifting like liquid, but with the form of a humanoid figure. It moved with unnatural speed, gliding across the floor toward Drake's team. "The darkness is free," Voss intoned. His voice was no longer his own. It was something older, darker. "And so am I." Drake's heart raced as the creature charged toward them, its form expanding with every second. The lights above them shattered, and the entire hallway plunged into pitch darkness, save for the glowing, sickly eyes of the thing in front of them. "No!" Drake screamed, but her words were drowned out by the rising cacophony of screams and chaos. In that moment, she knew. The prison wasn't just holding prisoners. It had been holding something far worse, something that had waited for the right time to awaken. And now, it was out. The darkness had swallowed the hallways, wrapping everything in a thick, suffocating fog. The air was heavy with a malevolent energy that seemed to pulse with every heartbeat. Captain Sienna Drake's mind raced as she tried to regain her bearings. Her weapon was useless against the nightmare before her, the massive amorphous creature that slithered and stretched with an unholy speed. "Captain, what do we do?" Markson's voice was strained, nearly panicked. "We can't fight this thing." Drake's fingers gripped the pistol in her hand, but her thoughts were already running in a dozen different directions. She had no answers. All she knew was that Voss, the nightmare, was no longer just a man. He had become something far more dangerous, and the very prison that had held him was falling apart under the weight of his awakening. Voss stood in the center of the chaos, his head tilted to the side as if listening to the groaning of the prison walls. His smile was no longer the deranged grin of a prisoner. It was something far more sinister, like the smile of something that had waited centuries to be freed. His eyes, if they could still be called eyes, were hollow black voids that seemed to draw in the very light around him. "You don't understand," Voss whispered, his voice a chorus of whispers. "This place, it wasn't built to contain me. It was built to contain what I became." The air around them seemed to grow colder, the oppressive atmosphere pressing in on their lungs. The creature that had formed from the shadows now writhed, its inky mass stretching like a living liquid. The walls were buckling, the floor cracking open, and the rumbling from below grew louder. Drake's eyes flicked to the walls, where the faint outline of symbols, the same ones they had found in the old section, appeared, glowing with a sickly light. These symbols seemed to pulse with every beat of the creature's heartbeat. They were alive. They were feeding on something, growing stronger as they spread across the prison. "Get out!" Drake shouted to her team. "Now! We have to warn command. We can't stop this." But as she turned to make her way toward the exit, a deafening screech echoed through the facility. It wasn't just the creature, it was the prison itself, as though the very foundations of the complex were screaming in agony. Voss lifted his hand, and with a simple gesture, the ground before them cracked open wider. A blast of raw, uncontrolled energy shot out, sending the team reeling backward. The air crackled with an unnatural force, and a gust of wind, cold, dark and sharp, ripped through the hallways. "Escape is futile," Voss murmured, his voice rising into a dark, resonant growl. "The darkness is already here. You've unleashed it. You've set it free." The air was thick with panic as Captain Drake scrambled to her feet. Markson and the remaining guards were already pulling themselves up, desperately trying to regain their footing as the prison continued to crumble around them. The ground beneath them was shaking, threatening to split open entirely. "Captain, we can't fight this thing. We need to go," Markson shouted, his voice barely audible over the growing chaos. Drake's mind raced. The creature was growing stronger with each passing second, its form shifting and pulsating like a grotesque reflection of reality itself. Every time it moved, the symbols etched into the prison walls seemed to glow brighter, as if they were feeding off its energy. The air felt thick, like something was crawling under her skin. But something else was happening too. Something far worse than the physical destruction of the prison. She could feel it, in the air, in the very ground beneath her feet. The darkness. It wasn't just a physical entity, or an energy source. It was a force, a consciousness, one that had been waiting for this moment. It had been imprisoned, locked away in the deepest recesses of the planet. But now it had found its freedom, and it wanted more. "Move!" Drake screamed, pulling Markson to his feet. "We need to get to the control center. We need to stop the lockdown before it's too late." The team moved quickly, racing down the corridors that were rapidly becoming unrecognizable. The walls were cracked open, black veins of shadow seeping through the concrete, as though the darkness itself was pouring into the very structure. The once sterile hallways had transformed into a twisted reflection of their former selves. They were no longer just corridors. They were alive, shifting and contorting, as if they were hungry, waiting for the inevitable. They reached the control center just as a sudden, violent explosion shook the facility. The entire hallway collapsed behind them, cutting off any hope of retreat. Inside the control center, screens flickered erratically, their displays filled with distorted data and static. Drake rushed to the console, her fingers flying over the controls. She slammed her palm against the emergency override button, but the system refused to respond. "Damn it!" she cursed under her breath. "The lockdown protocols are overridden. Someone's been tampering with the systems." "Voss," Markson muttered, his voice filled with dread. "He must have triggered it." Drake looked up at him, her face a mask of determination. "We don't have much time." If we don't contain this now, it will consume everything. The entire planet. Another tremor shook the building, this one stronger than the others. The walls groaned and creaked, as though the prison was on the verge of collapse. "Captain, we need to activate the self-destruct sequence. It's the only way to stop it," one of the guards suggested, his voice trembling. Drake hesitated, her hand hovering over the console. The idea of destroying the entire prison, the years of research, the technology, the countless lives that had been used and discarded here, it felt wrong. But the creature, the thing Voss had become, the darkness, it was too powerful. It had grown beyond their understanding, beyond anything they could contain. "If we do this, we'll be wiping out everything," Drake said, her voice low. "The entire facility, and anyone still here." "We don't have a choice," Markson replied, his voice grim. "The darkness won't stop, not until it consumes everything. It's already spread too far." Drake's fingers hovered over the control panel, her mind racing. She knew what the right decision was, but it didn't make it any easier. The self-destruct would be their only hope, but it would also be the end of everything they had worked for. The sound of crashing walls echoed from the hallways outside. The darkness was closing in. The floor beneath them trembled again, and the room flickered with bursts of erratic light. Drake glanced over at Markson and then to the remaining guards. They all knew the gravity of the situation. If they activated the self-destruct, they would have moments, maybe minutes, before the entire complex was vaporized. But if they didn't, the creature would spread, and Mars, already an inhospitable wasteland, would become a true graveyard for humanity. Without a word, Drake slammed her fist down on the self-destruct button. The control center lit up with flashing red lights as an alarm blared. The countdown had begun. She turned to Markson. "We need to get out of here, now." But just as they moved to leave, a voice, Voss's voice, echoed in their minds, no longer coming from his physical form, but from everywhere. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. "The darkness has already claimed this place. There is no running. There is no hiding." The walls groaned in response, and suddenly the entire room was filled with shadows. They moved like living things, crawling over the floor, creeping up the walls, blocking the exits. Drake's breath caught in her throat. The self-destruct was still counting down, but it didn't matter. The darkness was already here, and it was coming for them. The air was thick with tension, and the temperature had dropped to a frigid, suffocating chill. Captain Sienna Drake could feel her pulse in her throat, each beat a reminder that time was running out. The countdown for the self-destruct was already ticking away, but the shadows, those malignant forms, had flooded into the control room, cutting off their escape. It was as if the prison itself had conspired against them. "Get to the emergency exit," Drake barked, but her voice barely carried over the deafening wail of alarms and the strange, otherworldly hum that vibrated through the walls. The shadows moved, coiling and writhing with an unnatural fluidity, as if they were a part of something much larger, much older. Markson stepped forward, trying to fire his weapon into the mass of shifting darkness, but his shots were swallowed up before they could even reach their target. The rounds simply disappeared into the blackness, absorbed by it like water into a sponge. His hands trembled, the realization dawning on him that nothing they had, nothing they were, could stop what was coming. Then the voice, the haunting voice of Voss, echoed again, not from the speakers or from the air, but inside their heads. It was everywhere. It was in the walls, in the very air they breathed. It was as if the prison itself had become a conduit for something far more ancient. "You don't understand," Voss's voice echoed softly, almost sympathetically. "This place was never just a prison. It was a tomb for what I had become, what I was meant to become." The darkness has always been here, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment. Drake's heart pounded as the walls seemed to grow even darker, the shadows creeping like tendrils, curling around them with a predatory patience. It wasn't just the prison that was alive, it was the very planet beneath their feet. Mars had once been a barren wasteland, but something had been growing beneath its surface, something that had been buried for millennia. "What are you?" Markson asked, his voice shaking. He tried to aim his weapon again, but his hands wouldn't obey. His gaze flickered to the walls, to the dark symbols that were now glowing faintly, etched into the concrete like ancient runes. "I'm the Awakening," Voss's voice answered, almost tenderly. "The thing that was locked away, the thing that should have never been unleashed." Drake felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure in her chest, as though something was reaching out from within the walls, pushing down on her. Her vision blurred, and her body swayed, as though the weight of the air itself was suffocating her. "You released it, Captain," Voss continued, and his voice twisted into something cold, something not human. "Everything that you have ever known, everything you have ever believed, it was always a lie. The darkness has always been inside you." Drake shook her head, struggling to remain focused, but the world around her was unraveling. The shadows were no longer just crawling along the walls. They were growing, expanding outward, enveloping the room in a thick, impenetrable void. The very space seemed to bend, as though the prison itself was losing its form, succumbing to the malevolent force that had been awakened. "We are one now," the voice whispered. "I've been waiting for the time when this place would be ready, waiting for you." The ground rumbled again, the vibration deep enough to feel in their bones. The self-destruct countdown was nearing its end, but there was no escape from the darkness now. The walls groaned, buckling and twisting, as if the very structure of the facility was being pulled down into the abyss below. Drake's head was spinning, but she fought to focus. "We need to move, get to the escape pods." But as she moved towards the exit, she realized with a sickening certainty that there was nowhere to run. The darkness was everywhere now, more than just a physical presence. It was a force, an all-consuming energy that had begun to warp reality itself. The walls stretched and warped, distorting into impossible shapes. Behind them, the massive creature, Voss in his monstrous new form, slithered out of the shadows. His elongated limbs seemed to stretch beyond the limits of human physiology, his body contorting into a shape that defied all logic. The fog around him seemed to pulse with a terrible, primal energy, as though he had become one with the darkness. "No," Markson whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, this can't be happening." Voss raised his hand, and the shadows surged towards them with terrifying speed. The air around them grew heavier, pressing in on them from all sides. Drake's vision swam with flashes of distorted images, flickering memories of things she couldn't quite recall. Faces, whispers, and the sensation of something waiting for this exact moment. The last thing Drake saw before the darkness swallowed her was a flash of light, a brief, shining moment of clarity. The countdown continued, ticking down to its final moments. The creature, Voss, was no longer just a prisoner, a man twisted by the forces he had once unleashed. He had become something else, something far more terrifying. He was an avatar of the darkness itself, a living embodiment of the ancient force that had been buried beneath Mars for eons. The team was scattered now, lost in the oppressive blackness. Markson tried to fire his weapon once more, but it was futile. The darkness simply absorbed the bullets, leaving behind nothing but a trail of faint, sickly vapor. The temperature had dropped to an unbearable chill, and the air felt thick, suffocating. Drake stumbled forward, her hands gripping the walls for support. She could barely breathe, her eyes burned with the unnatural fog that clung to her, seeping into her skin, into her mind. The darkness whispered to her, coaxing her, trying to drag her into its depths. "Fight it," she muttered to herself, clutching her sidearm tightly. She couldn't let the darkness win. She couldn't let it consume them all. But it was already too late. The symbols on the walls flared bright, blinding her momentarily. In that instant, everything went silent. All the noise, the chaos, the crashing, the whispering shadows stopped. It was as if the prison had held its breath. Then the voice returned. Voss's voice. "You were never meant to be free, Captain," he said, his tone distant and cold. "You were always meant to serve the dark. It's always been part of the plan." The shadows surged toward her, wrapping around her, pulling her into the very walls of the prison. She screamed, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the void. The darkness was taking her, taking them all. The countdown hit 0. In the control room, the last moments of the self-destruct sequence played out in a chaotic flash of red lights. The facility, which had once held secrets more terrible than anyone could fathom, was about to be reduced to ash. And with it, everything, everyone, would be consumed. But even as the countdown finished, the darkness refused to be extinguished. The ground split apart beneath the prison, and the atmosphere of Mars itself seemed to tremble, as though something deep below had stirred. In those final moments, Captain Sienna Drake and the others were lost. Mars, once a barren world, was now a tomb. The darkness that had been locked away for millennia had found its freedom, and with it, the prison's terrible legacy was born again. But it didn't end there. Somewhere deep beneath the surface, something stirred, and the nightmare was just beginning.